Step into endless people that keeps you night. From comics to gaming, every nerd inside. She dives into the fandoms, exploring all the lore. Riley's the hostess, she'll take you on a tour. Welcome to Riley's Geek World, where the geeks are never alone. Discovering new dimensions in every episode. From black heroes to wizards and everything that's cool. Riley's Geek World, where geeks.
Hello, and welcome to Riley's Geek World, the podcast where I, Riley Murphy, talk about all things geeky. If you're a fan of sci-fi, fantasy, comics, games, movies, books, or anything else that makes your geek heart beat faster, you're in the right place. Today, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics ever, Star Wars video games, their history, and my personal favorites and least favorites. Star Wars video games are a huge part of my gaming life, and I'm sure many of you can relate. Ever since I was a kid, I've been fascinated by the Star Wars universe, and I've always wanted to explore it, experience it, and be a part of it. And video games have given me the opportunity to do just that, in so many different ways. Whether it's flying an X-Wing, wielding a lightsaber, commanding a squad of clones, or role-playing as a Jedi, Star Wars video games have allowed me to live out my Star Wars fantasies and have fun along the way. But what is the history of Star Wars video games? How did they come to be? And what makes them so special? Well, sit back, relax, and let me tell you the story of Star Wars video games, from a long time ago to a galaxy not so far away. Star Wars video games' story begins in 1977, when the first Star Wars film, later known as A New Hope, was released in theaters and became a cultural phenomenon. The film inspired many game developers who saw the potential of adapting the Star Wars universe to the interactive medium. Some of these developers were so eager to create Star Wars games that they didn't even bother to get the official license from Lucasfilm and released their games as unlicensed products. One of these games was Star Wars, a simple shooting game for the Apple II, released in 1978 by Apple Computer. The game, which you can play online today, is a fun little TIE fighter shooting gallery, where you have to destroy as many enemy ships as possible while avoiding their fire. The first officially licensed Star Wars game arrived a year later, in 1979, and it was not a video game, but a board game. It was called Electric Battle Command, and it was developed by Kenner, the same company that made the famous Star Wars action figures. The game featured an X-Wing, Luke Skywalker, and Princess Leia on the box art, but the gameplay had nothing to do with Star Wars at all. It was a simple strategy game where you had to avoid black holes and find the Force-giving star. The first true console Star Wars game didn't arrive until 1982, when Parker Brothers released Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back for the Atari 2600, and the Intellivision. The game was based on the Battle of Hoth scene from the film, and it allowed the player to pilot a snowspeeder and take down AT-AT walkers by shooting their weak spots. The game was a huge success, and it won the Strategists Club Award for Outstanding Play Aid. It also introduced some of the key elements that would define Star Wars games for years to come, such as the use of sound effects and music from the films, and the incorporation of the Force as a gameplay mechanic. In the following years, more Star Wars games were released for various platforms, mostly based on the original trilogy of films. Some of these games were arcade games, such as Star Wars, 1983, The Empire Strikes Back, 1985, and Return of the Jedi, 1984, which used vector graphics and a first-person perspective to recreate the most iconic scenes from the movies, such as the Death Star trench run, the asteroid field chase, and the speeder bike chase. Some of these games were home console games, such as Star Wars, 1987, for the Famicom, Star Wars, 1991, for the NES and the Game Boy, and Super Star Wars, 1992, for the Super NES, which used pixel art and a side-scrolling perspective to retell the stories of the films, with some added levels and enemies. The 90s were a golden age for Star Wars games, as the technology and the creativity of the game developers improved significantly, and allowed for more diverse and immersive Star Wars experiences. In 1990, Lucasfilm Games, later known as LucasArts, was established as the official video game division of Lucasfilm, and it became the main developer and publisher of Star Wars games. as well as other original titles, such as Monkey Island, Indiana Jones, and Grim Fandango. LucasArts created some of the most acclaimed and beloved Star Wars games of all time, such as Star Wars X-Wing, 1993, a space combat simulator that put the player in the cockpit of various Rebel starfighters, and its sequel, Star Wars TIE Fighter, 1994, which did the same for the Imperial side, Star Wars Dark Forces, 1995, a first-person shooter that introduced Kyle Katarn, a mercenary who would become a Jedi in later games, Star Wars Rebel Assault, 1993, a rail shooter that used full-motion video and CD-ROM technology to create cinematic sequences, and Star Wars Shadows of the Empire, 1996, a third-person action game that featured a new character, Dash Rendar, and a new story set between The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. LucasArts also collaborated with other studios to create more Star Wars games, such as Factor 5, which developed the Star Wars Rogue Squadron series, a series of arcade-style flight games that focused on the aerial battles of the Rebel Alliance. BioWare, which developed Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, 2003, a role-playing game that took place thousands of years before the films and introduced a new era, a new story, and a new twist to the Star Wars lore. And Pandemic Studios, which developed Star Wars Battlefront 2004 and Star Wars Battlefront 2, 2005, two multiplayer-focused games that allowed the player to participate in the large-scale battles of the Star Wars saga, from the Clone Wars to the Galactic Civil War. The 2000s were also a great time for Star Wars games, as the release of the prequel trilogy of films, from The Phantom Menace, 1999, to Revenge of the Sith, 2005, sparked a new wave of interest and inspiration for the Star Wars universe. Many Star Wars games were released during this decade, some based on the prequel films, such as Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace, 1999, Star Wars Episode I, Racer, 1999, Star Wars Episode II, Attack of the Clones, 2002, and Star Wars Episode III, Revenge of the Sith, 2005. Some based on the animated series Star Wars The Clone Wars, 2008, such as Star Wars The Clone Wars, Lightsaber Duels, 2008, Star Wars The Clone Wars, Jedi Alliance, 2008, and Star Wars The Clone Wars, Republic Heroes, 2009, and some based on the original trilogy or the expanded universe, such as Star Wars Jedi Knight 2, Jedi Outcast, 2002, Star Wars Jedi Knight Jedi Academy, 2003, Star Wars Republic Commando, 2005, Star Wars Empire at War, 2006, and Star Wars The Force Unleashed, 2008. The 2010s were a more turbulent time for Star Wars games, as the acquisition of Lucasfilm by Disney in 2012 and the subsequent closure of LucasArts in 2013 changed the landscape and the direction of the Star Wars franchise. Disney decided to license the Star Wars video game rights to Electronic Arts, which became the sole developer and publisher of Star Wars games under the EA Star Wars label. EA released several Star Wars games, such as Star Wars The Old Republic, 2011, a massively multiplayer online role-playing game that continued the story of Knights of the Old Republic, Star Wars Battlefront, 2015, and Star Wars Battlefront 2, 2017, two rebooted versions of the popular multiplayer shooter series with improved graphics, gameplay, and content. Star Wars Galaxy of Heroes 2015, a mobile collectible role-playing game that featured characters and battles from across the Star Wars saga. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order 2019, a single-player action-adventure game that followed the story of Cal Kestis, a young Jedi who survived Order 66 and fought against the Empire, and Star Wars Squadrons 2020, a space combat simulator that let the player fly various starfighters from the Rebel Alliance and the Galactic Empire. EA also faced some controversies and criticisms for some of their Star Wars games, such as the lack of content and the inclusion of microtransactions in the first Battlefront game, the cancellation of several Star Wars projects, such as Star Wars 1313, a third-person action game that would have starred Boba Fett, and the loot box scandal that plagued the launch of the second Battlefront game, which sparked a backlash from the fans and the media, and led to EA temporarily removing the feature from the game. In 2020, Disney announced that they would end their exclusive deal with EA and that they would create a new label, Lucasfilm Games, to oversee the development and publishing of Star Wars games, as well as other Lucasfilm properties. Disney also announced that they would partner with other studios to create more Star Wars games, such as Ubisoft, which is developing an open-world Star Wars game, and Quantic Dream, which is developing a narrative-driven Star Wars game. Additionally, Disney confirmed that the remake of Knights of the Old Republic, which is being developed by Aspyr Media, would be part of the official Star Wars canon, unlike the original game. So, what are some of my favorite Star Wars video games? Well, there are many, but here are some of the ones that I enjoy the most, and that reflect my own style and preferences. Here they are. My favorite era is the Old Republic era, because it is the most ancient and mysterious one, and because it has the most Jedi and Sith, which are my favorite factions. I also love the lore and the stories of this era, which are rich and epic, and which explore the origins and the conflicts of the Force. My favorite genre is the role-playing genre, because it allows me to create and customize my own character, and to make meaningful choices that affect the story and the gameplay. I also like the genre because it has the most dialogue and interaction with other characters, which makes the game more immersive and engaging. My favorite platform is the PC, because it has the most options and flexibility for playing Star Wars games. I can play with a mouse and keyboard, or with a controller, or with a joystick. I can also mod the games, or play online with other players, or stream the games to other devices. I can also access the most Star Wars games on the PC, thanks to platforms like Steam, Origin, and GOG. My favorite story is the story of Knights of the Old Republic, because it is the most original and surprising one, and because it has the most memorable characters and twists. I also like the story because it has the most moral ambiguity and complexity, and because it explores the themes of identity, redemption, and destiny. My favorite character is Revan, the protagonist of Knights of the Old Republic, because he is the most complex and mysterious one, and because he has the most potential and power. I also like Revan because he can be either a hero or a villain depending on my choices, and because he has a cool design and a cool name. My favorite gameplay feature is the lightsaber combat, because it is the most iconic and satisfying one, and because it makes me feel like a true Jedi or Sith. I also like the lightsaber combat because it has a lot of variety and customization, such as the different colors, styles, forms, and abilities of the lightsabers. Now for my all-time most and least favorite games. Let's start with my most favorites. Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic. Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic. This is my all-time favorite Star Wars game because it has everything I love in a role-playing game. A rich and original story, a diverse and memorable cast of characters, a deep and customizable combat system, and a lot of choices and consequences. I also love the setting of the Old Republic era, which is full of Jedi, Sith, and ancient mysteries. And of course, I love the twist, which is one of the best in gaming history. Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2. Rogue Leader. Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2. Rogue Leader. This is my favorite Star Wars flight game, because it makes me feel like I'm really piloting an X-Wing, a Y-Wing, or a B-Wing, and participating in the epic space battles of the original trilogy. The game has amazing graphics, sound, and gameplay, and it recreates some of the most iconic scenes from the movies, such as the Death Star trench run, the Battle of Hoth, and the Battle of Endor. It also has some original missions, such as the Raid on Bespin and the Strike at the Core. Star Wars Jedi: Fallen Order. Star Wars Jedi: Fallen Order. This is my favorite Star Wars action-adventure game because it has a compelling and emotional story, a likable and relatable protagonist, a fun and fluid combat system, and a beautiful and diverse exploration of the Star Wars galaxy. The game follows the journey of Cal Kestis, a young Jedi who survived Order 66 and fought against the Empire, while discovering the secrets of an ancient civilization. The game also has some awesome moments, such as the appearance of Darth Vader and the visit to Elam. And now for my least favorites. Star Wars: The Force Unleashed 2. Star Wars: The Force Unleashed 2. This is my least favorite Star Wars game because it is a huge disappointment compared to the first game, which I liked a lot. The game has a weak and short story, a bland and repetitive gameplay, and a wasted potential for the characters and the setting. The game follows the clone of Starkiller, the powerful and conflicted apprentice of Darth Vader, who escapes from his master and joins the Rebel Alliance. The game also has some ridiculous moments, such as the fight with a giant Gorog and the mind-tricking of an entire army. Star Wars Demolition. Star Wars Demolition. This is another Star Wars game that I dislike because it is a poorly made and boring game that has nothing to do with Star Wars. The game is a vehicular combat game, similar to Twisted Metal, where various characters and vehicles from the Star Wars universe fight each other in arenas. The game has bad graphics, sound, and gameplay, and it makes no sense in the Star Wars lore. The game also has some silly characters, such as Boba Fett on a speeder bike and a Rancor with a saddle. Star Wars Masters of Terraskazi. Star Wars Masters of Terraskazi. This is the last Star Wars game that I hate, because it is a terrible and frustrating game that tries to be a fighting game but fails miserably. The game is a 3D fighting game similar to Tekken, where various characters from the Star Wars universe fight each other in hand-to-hand combat. The game has awful graphics, sound, and gameplay, and it is very unbalanced and unfair. The game also has some absurd characters, such as a Tusken Raider, a Gamorrean guard, and a Stormtrooper. These are some of my favorites of Star Wars video games, but I'm sure you have your own, or you will soon. Star Wars video games are a great way to experience the Star Wars universe, and to have fun along the way. They are also a great way to express your creativity and to share your passion with other fans. That's all for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Riley's Geek World, and I hope you learned something new and interesting about Star Wars video games. If you did, please let me know by leaving a comment, a rating, or a review. And if you have any questions, suggestions, or feedback, feel free to contact me on social media or send me an email. I would love to hear from you and to know what you think of Star Wars video games. Next time, I will talk about another of my favorite topics, the Sandman comics and how Neil Gaiman created comic book history. So stay tuned and sweet dreams. Until then, this is Riley Murphy, signing off. Thank you for listening to Riley's Geek World, and remember, the Force will be with you, always. Bye!
Stepping through Riley's world, where we geeks unite. A podcast dedicated to all things out of sight. From comic books to movies, video games, and more. Riley's got the scoop, she's got the score. Welcome to Riley's Geek World, dreams come true. Deep into the geek culture just for you. Every episode, a brand new theme explored. In Riley's Geek World, there's never a dull corner.